How do we turn back to being led by the Spirit? As I went into this new year, I was just thinking of Paul's language of keeping in step with the Spirit. So how do we trust again that Spirit's at work and join the Spirit in what it's doing, rather than just coming up with that next brilliant plan or strategy? But how do we trust what the Spirit's doing and to trust the Spirit is actually at work? You cannot live in fear. I feel like the fear narrative is pretty strong at the moment, but Jesus is at work here.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sowers Podcast. My name is Matt Naismith, and I am your host. On this podcast, we share stories from church planters and leaders who are influencing kingdom movement and impacting their communities. Whether you're a church planter, a pastor in a church, part of a church planting team, or just curious to learn more, our hope is that these conversations inspire you to be a sower in the places where you live, work, learn, and play. If this podcast blesses you, we'd love for you to share episodes and subscribe on your preferred platform. Now, let's dive into our next conversation. Welcome, friends, to the Sowers Podcast. I hope you're having a fantastic day, however you're listening to this episode right now. Well, if you did not know, we are on YouTube, and so you can view all of these conversations on YouTube in their video format. You can find the Sowers Pod on YouTube. Go ahead and do that. Hit subscribe, follow if you prefer to find us in that way. As always, you may be listening to us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or another listening platform. Please go ahead and follow along so that you are updated whenever a new episode is released. Well, today I'm excited for you to hear a conversation that I had with Matt Pamplin. Matt Pamplin is a church planter and pastor based in Hamilton, Ontario. He founded St. Clair Community Church, which began as a small group and evolved into a vibrant community-focused congregation. Matt has also co-facilitated a next-generation leaders cohort with Vision Ministries Canada, mentoring young leaders in discipleship and leadership. He's known for his engaging speaking style and has been featured as a guest speaker at various events. Matt continues to reside in Hamilton with his family, where he continues to invest in community development and leadership training. In this conversation, Matt shares his journey from the UK to Canada, reflecting on faith, discipleship, and church planting. He discusses how YWAM shaped his ministry, the challenges of transitioning from missions to local church life, and the tension between idealism and the reality in church planting. Matt emphasizes the importance of spiritual family, relationships, and discipleship, and listening to the Spirit's leading while building a Christ-centered community. I think you're going to be blessed, inspired, and equipped in your sowing of the gospel in the places where you live, work, learn, and play by listening to this conversation. And so without further ado, here is that conversation with Matt Pamplin. Well, Matt Pamplin, a very special welcome to the Sowers Podcast. I have been looking forward to having you on for quite some time.
Well, thanks, Matt. It's good to be here. And if someone's looking forward to having me on the show, then that's great. That doesn't always happen, so I'll take that.
But I think our listeners are probably going to want to know right off the bat, Matt, your accent. Where is your country of origin and your delightful accent?
Born and bred in Ontario. Just kidding. No, I grew up. I started saying that after I moved here, just because everyone would ask me. Yeah. I just listened to a lot of BBC when I was a child. No, grew up in the UK, in England, just outside the second largest city called Birmingham. So that's where I grew up and moved to Canada 21 years ago for 1 year. Okay, what I thought God was doing, and then ended up staying.
Okay. Now, what is it like to be a Brit in Canada? I have some friends that are Brits, and I probably annoy them a lot with the accent. And I have this terrible, I know that probably some other people do this periodically, but it's interesting. Have you ever heard an accent and then you immediately in your mind are trying to mimic it, and then you accidentally speak backwards in that person's accent, and then you just embarrass yourself terribly?
Many times. Another one that's funny is I used to say if I go home, but if I go back to England, all my family's still back in England. So
okay,
my siblings and my parents, who moved. I married a Canadian. That's what brought me here. But when I go back, it's funny because friends will notice when I return back to Canada that I've been home, because I say the accent is a lot thicker just because I've been around that part of the world. But yeah, mimicking accents is definitely something that, especially in the UK, depending on Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, you'll find yourself with little lilts towards that accent, and friends were like, what are you doing? And you realize, actually, one very funny story when I first came, I think it was the first time I preached in Canada. I was at this small church, and my wife was behind these two little old ladies, and one turned to the other and said, can you understand anything he's saying? And the other lady said, nobody's accent's heavenly. And my wife was behind. So I have a friend who said my accent's my one spiritual gift. So it has been that. So
Yeah.
that's
Well, there you go. What has it been like being in Canada, being in church leadership? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I think initially, so when I first came, I just knew, I met my wife doing missions work with YWAM, Youth and Mission, this organization. And so I moved here. She had a year left at university. Previous to that, I'd worked with youth ministry and working for YWAM, doing missions overseas. So I kind of moved so she could finish school. And then, God, where are you leading us? And then a bunch of things fell into place, ministry-wise. Yeah, I think initially it was, when I first moved, someone said, oh yeah, well, it's really similar, right? Like similar accent, similar language, you both speak English. It's not quite the States, it's similar to England, but there are a lot of nuances I think you had to find. So I'd say initially, some of the good, like Les Newbegin, how do you be a good missionary stuff, I think was really important for me, ironically, because again, I think it was easy to fall into the trap of, we're similar, I'll just go, and it's fairly generic. But to contextualize and learn about a place and a people. And again, I moved to Hamilton and I've been here the whole time. I've been in Canada, despite all my friends saying, what are you doing? Why didn't you move to Vancouver, or Muskoka? But moved to Hamilton. And so even that, figuring out what's the culture of Hamilton, what's the history there. And then actually learning a lot just about Canadian culture. Things like, even some of the history connected with kind of residential schools, or some of the history that's gone on, was really new to me. So even that part of coming as an observer a lot of the time, or even people to have conversations about things that were very familiar to them about Canadian history. And I'm saying that's just something I need to learn about, which would be the same if someone came to the UK and wanted to know about the history of the monarchy and all those things. I will not make comment on the monarchy on the podcast.
Now, when the Queen died, did you feel like a grandmother had passed away? I have, as I said, I have friends from the UK, and I would say both of them said the way that they felt. So I'm not saying this is how you have to feel, but for them, it felt like my grandma had passed away to a degree.
Yeah, it's funny. It hit me harder than I thought it would. I would say I'm not anti-monarchy at all, but I wouldn't also be a monarchist. I love the monarchy. I'm probably fairly neutral, but I think the Queen was held in a lot of affection in the UK. So I definitely strangely had this emotion. And then my son and I homeschool my son. We actually watched some of the procession where people walked past the coffin and the reverence that was showed. And that was actually really moving to me. It was quite strange. Yeah, I would definitely say there was emotion there. And I think the Queen particularly moved from my generation, and particularly my parents' generation. That was pretty significant.
Matt, how did you come to know Jesus? How was the gospel sown in your life?
Yeah, so I grew up in a church family. I went to church pretty faithfully. My parents were both, I think, pretty passionate. But my mom particularly was very passionate about her faith in Jesus. I think for me, actually, that was, so definitely I'd say my parents, but then my mom had a friend who was a missionary who served overseas in a lot of places, when we did itinerant ministry, but would come back on furlough. And whenever she would come back, she would stay with us and come for dinner. And I remember her telling me stories about what God was up to in different places and how Jesus was at work. And I'll be honest, I remember thinking, I don't know what's going on here, but whatever that is, that Jesus you're communicating to me, that is worth pursuing and worth giving my life to. There was something just about the aliveness of Jesus in her life. And so I think that was really significant. And then I actually would say I made a commitment to follow Jesus. I had a younger brother who passed away a bunch of years ago, and he was really sick for a lot of years, needed to go in hospital for surgery. And it was almost like the story she was telling me collided with this almost realization of what was happening with my brother and his health and this crisis, I would say, in our family. And yeah, one day, all I can say is I was in church and I had a light bulb moment. And the way I describe it to my kids is all the stuff I'd heard that was intellectually interesting to me, I realized, I think this is reality. Wow. Jesus is real. And the trouble is, this now means I've got to I can't just leave that and go, kind of like Lewis. I can't just slough that off and say, he was just a great teacher. And there's something in that I have to pursue. So I'd say that was it for me.
How have you found that your own journey of coming to that understanding, the Holy Spirit did something in your heart, but how would you say that has driven you over the years towards Christian ministry, towards pastoring for moments for other people? Like how is that shaped?
Yeah, it's funny because I would always say I wanted to follow Jesus wherever he called me. There was just this deep sense that John chapter 6 has always been pretty significant for me, where Peter turns, after everyone else has left, and Peter turns and says, where else are we going? Do you have the words of eternal life? We believe and know you're the Holy One of God. So for me, it was like, oh, where else am I going to go? But ironically, I'd say I was a bit of a reluctant pastor. Background was kind of with YWAM parachurch. So that kind of apostolic parachurch stuff, I think in some ways I thought, oh, that's what I'll do. But then it's called myself the Jonah. I'm like, oh, Tarshish looks quite nice. And it's meant to be Spain, isn't it? So that's even nice. But then just felt the Lord constantly saying, oh, but you love people and you want to walk alongside them and you love to see the same understanding of what Jesus has done communicated in their life to bring healing and transformation. And so I think, there was always this pull and people just saying to me, I think God's called you into ministry. Like, I think that's actually, and even a local congregation. For me, it was almost, I think, isn't it Psalm 139, say, you lay your hand upon me, and it was almost like that sense of the Lord saying, this is where you're meant to be. And I would say my YWAM world, the emphasis on discipleship and all of life following Jesus in every facet of life all the time, that was pretty significant. And that's, I think, what led me like, oh, what does that look like then for the church to actually pursue this?
So talk then a little bit about that. You come out of YWAM. For our listeners that don't know, do you mind just sharing a little bit about what Youth with a Mission is?
Yeah, so it's a global missions organization and they run lots of different schools and programs at different kind of training centers around the world. Their main one is called the DTS, the Discipleship Training School. It's a 6-month program where you do 3 months, they call it the lecture phase, where you do learning, teaching, small group, serving around in the local community. And then you spend 3 months overseas in global mission to kind of put into practice the things you've learned. So for my first experience, I went to India for my global mission, and God just ruined my life in the best possible way. I think my eyes, as this young Englishman, my eyes were open to pretty abject poverty, what was going on in the world, how God was on mission in the world. And then they sometimes invite people to come back and help with some of their training schools. And then there's lots of other schools you can do. You go full time. So I went back for a few years and helped lead some of these discipleship training schools overseas.
So a high intensity 3-month to 6-month discipleship journey, right? Like an individual is coming with the intention probably for the most part, although as you and I know, sometimes we come in with these intentions and then God just flips them on their head. But the goal is like, this is a 6-month intensive DTS training school.
Yeah.
And so you shared there just briefly how that in a unique way prepared you for pastoring in the context of a local church. So fast forward with me, God invites you into church planting. How did the YWAM journey, your early years of pastoring, then set you up for church planting?
It's funny because we didn't talk about any of this ahead of time, but that is actually the question I was hoping you would ask me, because I think actually YWAM, I actually felt this inner angst, I would say. And it was the things I learned in YWAM, even though it was intensive and I know it's not everyday life, was how do we follow Jesus intentionally Sunday through Sunday. In some ways, I think my church experience was, how do we go once a week to this church service and then we follow up again on Sunday? Maybe there's a midweek Bible study, and that's what we do. And so I think YWAM in a way spoiled me and so my questioning ministry was always, how do these two things intersect? How does our Sunday gathering of people then get lived out throughout the rest of the week in different ways that we interact with our own spiritual community, but also the world around us? And so I think that it shaped me a lot, and to take seriously, following Jesus isn't just a plug and play at my own spiritual times of the week. And I think also God is at work all the time in all things. I know no one would admit this, but sometimes it's almost like we show up on Sunday, I'm like, right, I'm ready because God's going to show up now because I've dedicated that hour and a half. And then you realize throughout the scriptures, God is at work all the time in lots of different ways if we would just pay attention. So I think for me, that intensity. Now, I will say the challenge of YWAM is you come out of this and realize you can't just live for 6 months every day with a group of other young people for the rest of your life in quite the same way. So also, how do you help bring some of that into a local congregation where people have jobs and family life and they're trying to live in their neighborhood and their kids have hockey practice and they've, whatever that might be. So some of that was what I need to reflect on as I pastored. But I always say, YWAM days helped me to be a pastor, I think.
I want to get back to the church planting journey, but I know of some individuals who experience something like a YWAM and they come out of it and tragically they stop following Jesus. Speak to that as you've had obviously some experience with it. Someone that I know, I think in part for them was the intensity and the goodness of the Christian community was so good that they came out and every other Christian community just seemed hypocritical to an extent. And then it was like, was that thing that I experienced even real? Like, obviously there's the world, the flesh and the devil, but as you had that experience, and again, we'll transition back to like the rhythms of everyday life, but what is it about some of those experiences that can at time, I don't know, there's a mystery in that journey, but as you've been given thought to it over the years, what is your perspective on it?
Yeah, I thought a lot. I will say a couple of things right out of the gate. I think what you said is really, I don't want to say common story, but I've heard a lot of those kind of stories. Did YWAM, really found it difficult when returning home. I would also say, and I think it's important, not every YWAM experience is great. And you would know this. For me, I was very fortunate. I think the place I was, the leadership, and that matters a lot in YWAM. The leadership was experienced, very thoughtful, and was quite broad theologically, I think, in a good way, and had good grounding. So I think for me, I was very fortunate. I've heard, and I know that, so there's probably listeners going, oh, I had a really hard YWAM experience. So I acknowledge that. I do think, like churches, you could have the same denomination, but wherever you go, we'll have a different experience. I think it is a very intense time. And I think it's almost the experience you have, even with God, you assume, I'm going to go back and everyone is going to be at the same intensity as me, and my church should be at the same intensity as I am. And then when you get back and you then start to think, does no one else care about following Jesus? And what are they doing? Like, am I the only one? And so you actually become frustrated rather than realizing the transfiguration, right? Let's stay here and build. That could be seen as your YWAM experience. Right. And then Jesus says, no, we can't stay here. And of course, the next encounter, ironically, is the demon-possessed person, right? And so you have this moment of what happens next when we've left this very intense experience. And I think I would say for young YWAMers, how do you take what you've learned, but try and live that out faithfully, also for the long haul?
Yeah.
I think, one of the phrases I think about a lot in my life at this stage is playing the long game. And we would both know lots of people who started with a lot of passion. And so how do you help them live this out in their life and even in the mundane things of life? But also I have compassion for them because I think God has met them. And I don't know if they always return back with the tools or support to be able to do this right. And so how do we help people? By the time I was leaving YWAM, we did a lot of work with how do we help people integrate back in a way and come back to serve their community, not necessarily always have to critique or criticize the community they come back to.
Well, maybe what's interesting is in our conversation so far, there's kind of this contrast between a Sunday morning experience. At pastoring, it can feel like we're trying to put together this spiritually powerful event, which, not to take anything away from them, they can be quite powerful moments of Christian family coming together. And the church I planted, we called our Sunday mornings reunions because it was the family of God coming back together to see one another celebrate Christ. But it's sort of an event versus like an environment of discipleship. And in kind of the conversation around YWAM, we're talking about like an event that is like 6 months long, but then contrasted to like the environment of everyday life that then you transition back towards. Right. And I know of, people who've worked in Christian camp ministry, for example, and there's the traditional testimony that the first week, if you're a return counselor, you're back for a couple weeks. How'd your last year go? Well, I had this amazing time last year and I left and now I made all these mistakes, but I'm back again and, let's go for it. Again, more of an event versus an environment. Take us now then to planting a church with the heart to say, we're going to create an environment of discipleship in the everyday stuff of life where you live, work, learn, and play 24/7, Sunday to Sunday.
Yeah, I think that's good. I will say just one thing on the last point. I love what you said. How does the event also then fit with the environment? Because I think we can see them as two opposite things rather than the event works if it's integrated into an environment. So we can have moments where we need to retreat.
Yes.
And that can help. So I think how those flow together. Yeah, I think that was my question coming into planting was, what does it look like to see us try and follow Jesus together in community? This idea a couple of things became really important to me. What does place and proximity actually look like? I would say a theology of place. I think my parents gave me that without me knowing when I was younger. We went to this local church and my mom was pretty passionate about that. And I didn't really think anything of it other than, okay, I guess that's because we moved house and we ended up, my mom said, we've got to go to our local church.
Was it walkable?
Yeah, it was. So,
yeah.
I mean, we drove, but it was walkable.
Okay.
And it was in the local community close to where my parents lived. And I think, again, something about that as I got older, we moved to downtown Hamilton. And ironically, the church that we planted from was actually in the suburbs of Hamilton in a place called Waterdown. And so my wife and I bought a house downtown because we could afford it long before the prices went crazy. And I would drive back to the church that I was associate pastor at. And I loved the church, but there was a bit of this dissonance between, I was talking to my neighbors, people around us who were interested in faith, and they'd be like, oh, where's church? And I was like, oh, well, we drive 20, 25 minutes to Waterdown. And they would laugh and be like, oh, these weren't people who would claim any Christian faith, but thought that was kind of strange. So I think theology of place was important. And I also think a conviction around family. What did it actually look like to live out faith as this kind of spiritual family? And I think the movement of the language of discipleship in the Gospels, moving towards this Greco-Roman culture of Paul and this family language that Paul starts to use, but is the incubator for discipleship. So now I realize family comes with a lot of questions and even baggage for people because of their own family of origin, but still the heart behind what was happening, I think, was really important. And so rather than asking, how do we find a building, a sound system, and just start a Sunday gathering? Now, again, we've both alluded to, I'm for those things because we ended up having that. But that wasn't the first question I was asking. Right. It was like, how do we communicate good news of Jesus into a neighborhood and then start to live in some rhythms in that place that would allow us together to learn how to follow Jesus in this place and this time?
Friends, we'll get back to my interview with Matt Pamplin in just a moment. Prior to that, however, I want to let you know about Vision Ministries Canada, who Matt works with. The vision of Vision Ministries is more churches on mission and more people following Jesus, pursuing virtue, justice, and the reconciliation of all things. Their mission is to plant and invigorate churches by nurturing, inspiring, and collaborating with leaders and cultivating a partnering network of churches, primarily in Canada. Not only does Vision invest in leaders, but also in networks where radical independent churches often flounder. Synergistic relationships enable greater flourishing. Without controlling churches, Vision Ministries connects them to others for their own well-being and for their collective kingdom impact. The VMC Partnering Network catalyzes the sharing of stories, opportunities, people, needs, ideas, and resources. And together they believe that they can accomplish more than they could possibly accomplish on their own. Their values are to be missional, relational, pioneering, and Jesus-centered. If you'd like to learn more about Vision Ministries Canada, you can visit vision-ministries.org. Once again, that is vision-ministries.org. and Matt Pamplin serves as one of their church planting catalysts. And now back to my interview with Matt.
So now both of us have transitioned from staff roles in the church that we planted and then pastored because they both became established. We had common friends between ourselves over the years, had very similar flavors of the type of churches that we were desiring to see come to fruition. With hindsight now, looking back, thinking about that early vision of spiritual family, powerful environment throughout the week, what are the things that you are feeling still absolutely committed to? And what are the things that you felt like, oh, maybe that was a little bit of the church planter? At times there's like that rebel spirit, I think, in every church planter, like we're going to be so local and we're not going to drive anymore. And there's going to be no church issues like the churches in the suburbs face. But like, what are the things that you would say, no, like these are the things that we realized and determined. These are absolute spiritual commitments of a Christian community together.
As you're saying, that would be even laugh. I'm thinking in my brain about some of the idealism of things like, oh man, how did they have the problems? We'll be fine. And then like, oh man, you come forward to the Holy Spirit's very gracious. Yeah, I think I'm still committed to a meal with people that builds some spiritual rhythms. We still do it. Even though I'm not on staff, my wife and I still host a missional family, we call them. This family where we try and gather with people, different walks of life, different ages and stages, where we eat a meal together. We look at the text about how that applies to us, and we try and love our neighborhood well. So I think that feels important because I think it's the crucible of discipleship still, being in proximity with one another and trying to live that out. And then the ebbs and flows of life, right, that people go through. And not just, even that, not just being a once-a-week meeting, but how do we do life with these people throughout the week? Because again, I think even this missional community thing that we talk about, it's so great, but it can almost be Sunday light if we're not careful, I think, in some ways. So how do we move beyond that? How do we do baptisms there? How do we celebrate birthdays? How do we actually walk with people in pain and challenge in their life? So I'm still, I think, committed to that because I think it's in that I see, I'd say this about it. So with us, we always had our kids involved with our missional family and the relationships my kids have formed with people who are older than them. So sometimes young people in the 20s, actually just last Sunday, an amazing girl in our missional family took my daughter out skating because they'd formed a relationship and she's mentoring her. My son wants to be a mechanic. And so he went over to my buddy's house who loves cars. I'm not really into cars, but I've tried to for my son. But my friend who lives on the next street is an engineer and he loves cars. So when he wanted to fix his car, he went to my friend Joel on the next street to learn how to fix the car. Anyway, so those kind of relational pieces I think have been really significant. So I'm pretty committed to that. I think my idealism around this will do everything for us is definitely something I learned. Like if we just do this well, that'll solve like discipleship and realizing it's probably a good first container, but we're going to need lots of other things still that almost like the spoke in the wheel, the center of a wheel, and then having these spokes that come off it and realizing it can do some things well, but it just cannot do everything. So I think that was an idealism. Similar, I think when you really do this and invite people into deep relationship, challenges will arise. Even to the point where one real big learning for me was the neighborhood we planted in was really fascinating. Lots of affluent young adults coming because our house prices were cheaper. We could afford it. But lots of historic poverty from the collapse of the steel industry. And so a lot of people living in poverty. They would come for a breakfast. We always hosted a breakfast on a Sunday morning. And then they would hear about missional family. People from different walks of life say, can we be part of that? And I was like, yeah, of course you can. But I don't think we'd account that because I think a lot of ministry is what we do for people rather than particularly that kind of ministry. We serve them food rather than, oh no, be part of this because we actually believe you're family too. And so that collision course of, again, maybe young idealism of, oh, this will be great and it'll work out like this, colliding with people who have bringing challenges in, but also teaching us how to live in this neighborhood and the things they bring. So I look back and it was an amazing collision, but it was very humbling for me. Because I'm like, oh yeah, we don't just go and do ministry for people. We invite them into this. So yeah, I think that as well. And also, I remember There's a pastor in the States, John Tyson, who probably people on this podcast might be familiar with, Church of the City. I don't know where he said this, but I remember him. A young planter came up to him and said, "John, what's the one piece of advice you would give me when church planting?" And he paused and he said, "What's your pain threshold?" And the young planter went, "John, I don't think you understood the question. Inspire me for like minutes." And then he said, "Well, what's the next thing?" And he paused and he said, "What's your spouse's pain threshold?" And I don't say that to, I say that to just remind us of it's the most amazing journey, but what comes with it is cost and challenge, because like you allude to, Matt, the idealism maybe we started out with gets confronted. And so, so I look back. Oh, the other thing I would say is we built a lot on relationship, like it's missional family concept. And I think relationship is really important. But as we grew, what's the structure that can hold this thing, not crush it, but still hold it? And I think we often felt like we were catching up to what God was doing, and we didn't always know well how to structure things, which then means people can get missed because you're trying to catch up with this structure and communication. And I've got a long list of things I would do differently, but there'd be a few things I think.
Yeah. I'm wondering if you would share a few of those pain points along the way and how, I mean, again, hindsight here, how you got through them.
Yeah, I think we were so committed to this relational thing. You're in community with people, you're going to do life with people. And a wise friend, a young guy who I mentored for years, we went for a walk, and he said, what's fascinating is when it's going well, it's the best thing that can be happening. And he even said Hamilton's the best place to be. But when there's challenges and difficulty, it's the worst because you're so interconnected. You know, we had people living in the same house as one another, like renting space together. There were neighbors, there were family members. And so I think the relational challenge of that and maybe being misunderstood or the pain of the relational fallout, I think that was something that, I look back on and that was really difficult. Maybe people you've walked with and journeyed with who you realize, I'm going to be walking with you forever and journeying with you forever. And I think probably one of my weaknesses as church leader at times was not intentionally, but people like, I want to make sure everyone's on the same page. And how do we do this well? And we can have unity, and then realizing, it's not always going to work like that. And so how do you navigate that when there's people you journey with? You realize you're not going to journey with them for a while. So that was one. And then trying to make decisions that, and you know this, just not everyone agrees with. And so how do you do, particularly in the early phases of like, this is where I think that God has called us. And everyone, as you know, has an idea of what they think the church plan should look like. You know, especially when you're in a more committee in the early stages. I think this is where we're going. Let's have buy-in. Let's everyone join in with this thing. And then somewhere as you're going, you realize, actually we're going here, but other people think we should be going over here, and trying to make those decisions. I realized there was one, I still vividly remember one leadership team meeting, and we spent about 2 hours talking about this thing because we wanted to find the best way out of this decision. And I remember saying at one point, just so you know, there's no best way out of this. We've just got to pick, as in, there's not a third way where everyone's going to love this and be happy. Right, we've got to pick what we think is the right thing to do.
What did you find, and it's probably all slightly determined, so maybe I'm answering the question as I'm asking it, but do you think is the right balance between, a term that I heard constantly was organic. Like we want our families to be organic, and not as far as nutrition, but genuinely like we want it to feel organic. So here's a good example. When we planted this church, we said that, we didn't want people to feel pressured, but enjoying one another. So when we started having a Sunday celebration, our reunion, I said, hey guys, it'd be great if we had coffee made on time. We should create a coffee schedule. I didn't anticipate that to be a controversial suggestion, but it was like, why do we need to have a coffee schedule? Like, don't we want things to be organic? And then as time went on, we did add some of those structures, and we got a planning center license to make sure people were scheduled for things, and the church grew. But But then at times there was maybe a feeling that did we maybe overstructure it so that we lost some of the critical culture pieces that we were trying to pursue? What's your perspective on the tension? Because I don't think that's like a problem to solve thing. I think that's a tension to manage, as Andy Stanley would say. How did you find that?
Yeah, I love that question. And I think anyone listening who's planting will live into that reality. That tension, I think, remains in a good way. And I think you probably, my sense would be, and I might be wrong, you probably lean one side or the other slightly. Now, the question is, if you sit completely on one side, it might cause you challenge. So if you're completely organic and there's absolutely no structure, it's probably going to be hard. If you're so rigid that there's not this relational organic piece. And so it's almost pick which side you slightly want to lean on. But that was a question we would ask, I think, as we would be organic in the early days. And partly because I think we had a bunch of people coming out of the quite rigid, programmatic church environment of everything's so rigid. We don't really have relationship as deeply as we want them and everything's programmed. So obviously you can lean the other way. But I think there was a point where, like I always said to people, you know what? If we're having dinner, it's helpful to know what time dinner is to show up for. You know, like if we're going to eat my family dinner at 6 and my kids know we're showing up at dinner at 6, that's just really helpful for building structure. But if you're so rigid and like, okay, and dinner's 10 minutes and that's it and we're done and we're not talking, but we've got to get this done, that doesn't build relationship. So does the structure you're building still facilitate the relationship to work and to thrive? And so I think, over time, we really had to build some of those in and realize also that's growth and that's healthy, right? I think as you grow up, and that's the other thing, church plants go through this cycle of, and the other thing I'd say, people around in the early days, they're the ones who I think find it hard because they grieve, things are changing. And we thought it'd be this amazing thing where there was 20 of us in someone's front living room and it'll always be like this, which I get because, it does feel like they were beautiful times. But then and everyone's like, but we want more people to join us. So what happens? More people join and then go, I wish we went back to where there was like 20 of us in the Lily Brew. Right. And I totally understand. But then how do you build that structure? Because if there's 20 I used to joke, someone bring snacks, someone bring a guitar, someone look after the kids. That's great. That's literally your planning. But then if you've got 100 of you, that just doesn't work in the same way. Mm-hmm. So then you have to plan accordingly, still trying to keep, like you said, the value of how do we build relationship. But I think you just then have to structure. So I would always say structure so the Holy Spirit and relationship still happens. And the other piece is, do you plant again? Because I think there's this bit of, we're growing, so we just need to go on this upward curve. But actually, maybe you need to multiply out the DNA you had to start anything else.
Some I've heard describe it as, at times what can happen is that the model becomes the mission rather than the model serving this greater mission. Where would you kind of fall in that conversation? Do you think that's too maybe black and white in some sense? Like sometimes your model is particular in a sense that you believe that the model can reach a particular group of people. So we need to keep the model so that we can stay engaged missionally in that way. Like I know a lot of conversation around missional communities and missional families is something of that, right? Even if you think about your own origin story with it, it's like, okay, we want to be local. We want to be people, local presence. How do we do that? Well, we prioritize meals. We prioritize removing, in essence, a commute time so that our lives can overlap more often. So that's a certain commitment to a model in order that you might reach a local community, which is your mission. But I suppose you can also go overboard on that. And suddenly the model is like, well, it doesn't feel like we're doing missional family anymore, but nobody's been reached in months.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I think that I've actually had a bit of conviction of the Holy Spirit on this over the years. I think I was idealistic at the start. It was like, this is the way church planting should be done. Why are we not doing this? And I think for us, God gave us, this is what you should do at this place and this time in this neighborhood where I've called you. And I do think starting out missionally small, there's something in that. I think I would say there's a bit of hat in the New Testament of how do you do it? But I think I've also had to really repent of, one, thinking of other people who've planted in different ways and going, oh, I'm going to be honest, the amount of planters who are like, yeah, that's great. But secretly thinking, yeah, but if you really planted, like, we're like more authentic because we started this way, and just realizing Jesus will use whatever he wants to bring people to himself. And the amount of times I've heard people and thought kind of smugly, well, we didn't do it that way. And then Jesus is just blessing them all over the place.
Yeah.
So I think, I've also, I think when I started out was almost trying to do, this is the new way we should be church. I mean, it's an ancient way, but we should be planting this way. And now I think I more tell my story as this is what God called us to do at this time in this place. But I think you need to listen. I'm a big believer in you've got to listen to the Spirit. And the one thing I would say is we have tried for too long to take a prepackaged thing we've heard somewhere else and just try and implement it where we are. I think we can learn a lot of things from that. But the time and energy to listen to Jesus, to take some time to pray, to do some discernment and ask, what are we called to do in this place, in this time, in this neighborhood? I think that's something that's really important. And that might be different for different people.
So you and I now have somewhat similar roles in different organizations where we're walking alongside aspiring church planters, people wanting to engage in mission, sow the gospel in a more intentional way through vocation. What are on the list of the top 3 things that you're trying to help an individual discern as they're stepping out into what they're getting the sense is maybe that journey for themselves?
Do you mean specifically they feel called to plant and they're starting out on that journey?
Yeah. Or they're expressing like, hey, I have interest in this.
Yeah, I think, that's a really good question. I think one is just trying to hear first and foremost what they feel it is God is leading them into, whether that's like a geographical place is one thing, but also their story, like what has God been doing in your life and how are you being led this way, to try and first and foremost to probably hear their story of how God has led them. I think one is the bivocational question or co-vocational, that comes up a lot, but how I think some people, depending on where they've come from and their church background, are like, oh, this would be great. I'll somehow find a way to be self-funded and I'll just step out and do this church planting thing. But what does that look like in terms of their calling to be bi or co-vocational? And then another one actually is, I feel like it's to encourage people to pursue planting. I don't know what you find out. I feel like there was a season of church planting was the thing that was on everyone's lips and even you'd go to camp or you talk to university or seminary students who are like, yeah, I feel God's called me to church plant. And now it's like, yeah, I really feel called to a tech startup company, or I feel called to this over here. And all those things are amazing, but a bit more, I've been praying, Lord, would you bring about again the next generation of planters that you want to raise up in Canada? And then how do we come alongside them and say, we want to come alongside you, support you, and equip you for what God has called you to do? Where is the Missio Dei and how do we get involved in that? But almost speak that into some people, because whether it's the current church climate or what, I feel like that feels less something I'm hearing. But for a season, it was like, oh yeah, church planting was something that almost, like Paul says, deeply desire. These things, I feel like that was something that a lot of people desired, and now it feels less on people's radar. And so how do we, I'm trying to think of the word to use. How do we find out where God is at work in people's lives? And as we sense there might be some apostolic thing there, encourage them to even think that. One of the things I've been thinking about, I think you said 3, this maybe 3.5, is are there places and churches that we could intern people in for a season, like an incubator almost, to be planted out of? I know that's probably common for a lot of people, but to have churches not just think we want to get bigger, but what if we could actually plant out of this church that seems to be in a place that's thriving?
Just as we close, Matt, do you have any impressions of what God by his Spirit is inviting the church to in Canada?
No pressure. Well, I think that, a couple of things. I think how to return back to being led by the Spirit. As I went into this new year, I was just thinking of Paul's language of keeping in step with the Spirit. So how do we trust again that Spirit's at work and join the Spirit in what it's doing, rather than just, I know this is common stuff, but just coming up with what's our next brilliant plan or strategy, but how do we trust what the Spirit's doing? And to trust the Spirit is actually at work. That we just cannot live in fear. I feel like the fear narrative is pretty strong at the moment, but Jesus is at work here. And the second is, I think that Jesus is at work and is doing things, but it might not look like the things we've always done. And again, I know that gets rolled out. I'll close with this. Someone said to me, a young person, Matt, well, what if the church in Canada needs to burn to the ground? And I was like, maybe. And they were like, what are you talking about? And I said, maybe the forms or some of the things need to. Oh, the body of Christ, Jesus is always at work raising that up. Jesus is the head of the church and he is before all things and he holds all things together. Jesus is fine. He's doing his thing. But some places, maybe the way we've done things, maybe that is to go, but it doesn't mean Jesus isn't doing something. And I'll close with this thought. A bunch of years ago, I was talking to a friend and he was having a bit of a crisis in his ministry. And he said one day he was in his kitchen and he felt the Holy Spirit whisper to him, Adam, I'm a better pastor than you are. And I think about that a lot, as in,
wow.
Oh yeah, actually, Jesus is a way better pastor than I am. And so how do I trust that and that he is constantly doing something in and around us?
Well, friends, I'm sure you would agree that there is so much from my conversation with Matt Pamplin that could be applied as this episode's action step. As I was reflecting with Matt on his own church planting journey, it allowed me to spend some time reflecting on my own. And so here's the action step from this episode. Matt talked about a number of things, about his idealism as a church planter. He talks about some of the things that he is coaching or mentoring into leaders that he is working with. I simply want to invite you to spend some time reflecting on your own journey. Maybe you've been part of a church plant. Maybe you're not. Maybe you're part of an established church. Wherever you are, I want to invite you to spend a little bit of time reflecting on your experience so far. You can write down some of your highs, some of your lows. You can write down some of the lessons that you believe God has been teaching you along the way. So often we don't stop to reflect, to practice gratitude for what God has done, but then also to sometimes mourn and lament some of the pain that we've experienced, and to then reflect intentionally on the lessons that God was teaching us along the way and in the journey. And you had the opportunity, as well as I did, to hear some of Matt's reflection on his own church planting journey and some of the work that now he is doing with Vision Ministries Canada. So action step, spend some time in reflection on your journey, highs, lows, elements of God's grace, where you mourn, where you're lamenting, but also where you're practicing gratitude and celebrating what God has done and is doing. Well, friends, as always, thanks for joining us for this episode of the Sowers Podcast. We will have a new episode next week with Jason Persad of Alpha Canada and the Culture Changers. And to get you excited and to give you a little bit of a taste of that episode and conversation, here's a clip.
We need the wisdom of Paul, when to preach, when to listen, when to ask questions, because Paul used an incredible tactic. He said, I was walking by and I saw this inscription, to the unknown God. And he says, I'm going to tell you about that. Paul saw their spiritual curiosity. Paul saw the openness. And instead of insulting them, instead of condemning them or belittling them, he actually affirmed that they were spiritually curious and respected them for where they were, and it gave him freedom to share the gospel.